Black woman stands before corrupt judge and arrogant judge. Then the Supreme Court chief walks in. The air conditioner in the courthouse hallway hummed like a distant storm. I found myself trembling despite the chilly breeze. Every step I took felt heavier than the last. The polished floors glimmering beneath the fluorescent lights like a stage anticipating its leading actor. My heart pounded in my ears, for I knew that in a matter of minutes I would be facing off against not one, but two powerful judges rumored to be as corrupt as they were arrogant. Cameras flashed in my peripheral vision. Reporters whispered my name, Maya Caldwell, to one another with urgent curiosity. Little did they know how drastically the script would change when the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court himself made a sudden appearance. Before we dive in, if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. If you're excited about this story, let us know. Your feedback really inspires me to gather more uplifting and meaningful stories. I remember vividly the morning I first entered that monumental courthouse in downtown D.C. The structure seemed carved from blocks of pure marble, its towering columns stark against the pale winter sky. Each echo of my heels on the gleaming floor sent a shiver through me, reminding me of the gravity of my case. Outside, activists marched with signs proclaiming justice for all, while bystanders peeked curiously from behind barricades. Even the local news station, WSA-9, had cameras and microphones angled at the entrance, capturing the tension etched into the day. A security guard politely checked my ID. He briefly looked at me, my dark hair pinned into a braid, my stance resolute, and offered only a stiff nod as he cleared me, though I tried to exude composure. My hands gripped the folders tucked beneath my arm. File upon file contained testimonies, affidavits, and evidence pointing to most unthinkable conspiracy, that two judges in a local circuit court were systematically rigging cases based on bribes, racial bias, and personal vendettas. I was determined to fight for those who were unable to defend themselves. Yet a small voice in the back of my mind whispered, "This is bigger than you. Maya, are you ready?" As I stepped into main lobby, the cavernous dome above me amplified every footstep and every hushed breath. The architecture was breathtaking. Murals of Lady Justice on the ceilings, marble statues of historical figures near the columns. Yet the regal beauty felt overshadowed by the labyrinth of rumors swirling around two of the most feared men on the bench, Judge Robert Langston and Judge Martin Holloway. For months I had compiled evidence of their unethical practices, hidden offshore accounts, suspicious property acquisitions, and statements from terrified attorneys who insisted on anonymity. Despite the hush-hush environment, enough glimpses of corruption had emerged that I was asked, practically begged, by a local civil rights organization to challenge the system. They saw something in me, perhaps a mix of legal acumen and unwavering moral conviction. I approached the clerk's window to verify my presence for the day's docket, a preliminary hearing related to a high-profile discrimination suit. The moment I saw the clerk raise an eyebrow at my name, an uneasy tremor passed through me. "Ah, Miss Caldwell," he said, tapping on a keyboard. "Courtroom 6A, with Judges Langston and Holloway presiding." He paused before adding, sotto voce, "Watch yourself in there, ma'am." I nodded, pulse kicking, refusing to let my confidence waver. Courtroom 6A was notorious. It was rumored that when Judge Langston and Judge Holloway were assigned to the same proceeding, little good came of it unless your pockets were deep or you played the system's twisted rules. The room itself, however, appeared immaculate. Polished oak benches, stone pillars carved with legal motifs, and an imposing bench front and center. I took my seat at the plaintiff's table, setting my files neatly before me. My client, a soft-spoken librarian named Mrs. Jennings, sat beside me, hands trembling in her lap. She was in her mid-50s, an African-American woman who worked tirelessly in her community for decades. She never imagined she'd be forced into a lawsuit against a well-connected real estate tycoon who wanted to evict her from her family property. But what shocked me was the evidence that Langston and Holloway had vested interests in that same real estate group. If those allegations were true, my client stood little chance unless we exposed the corruption that tainted their seat on the bench. Across the aisle, the defense counsel arranged their papers methodically. Their lead attorney, a tall, sleek figure in a charcoal suit, offered me a smug grin. Then the bailiff called out, commanding all to rise as the judges entered. The gavel's crack echoed to the silent chamber, and my breath caught in my throat. Judge Langston, tall and gaunt with a piercing gaze, cleared his throat. Beside him sat Judge Holloway, a short, round man whose sly grin did nothing to hide his arrogance. As they surveyed the courtroom, I caught the slightest curl of contempt on Langston's lip, an expression that made my stomach churn. "Good morning," Langston said, voice clipped. "We're here to address the preliminary motions in Rhodes versus Lancaster." His eyes flicked to me, then settled on the defense. Holloway leaned in, whispering something that elicited an amused scoff from Langston. I tried to quell my racing heart. On the record, we had no direct evidence linking them to the real estate tycoon shell companies. All I had were suspicious patterns, whistleblower accounts that risked their own careers, and property transaction documents reeking of impropriety. It felt like peering into a dark tunnel, without a clear light at the end. Still, I stood with as much poise as I could muster. "Maya Caldwell, for Mrs. Clara Jennings, your honors." My voice sounded steady. "We're prepared to move forward with the motion to compel document production from Lancaster Real Estate Holdings." Holloway smirked. "Quite ambitious, Miss Caldwell," he drawled, exchanging a glance with Langston. "Proceed." That morning's arguments began in a predictable fashion. The defense objected to each of my requests, labeling them overly broad and fishing expeditions. Holloway frequently interjected with condescending remarks toward me, while Langston nodded, granting nearly every objection. The rigging was so blatant it made my skin crawl. Each time I tried to point out the patterns of harassment, the judges brushed off my arguments, dismissing them as irrelevant to the current motion. My client, Mrs. Jennings, gripped my forearm, her eyes silently begging me not to give up. I whispered reassurances, even though I felt the weight of injustice pressing down. During a brief recess, a junior clerk hurried over, quietly alerted me that a major development had just hit the courthouse's rumor mill. The Chief Justice of the United States, Henry Whitmore himself, was in the building on unrelated business, possibly meeting with the Court of Appeals. The instant I heard that name, my pulse leapt. Supreme Court justices rarely waltzed into local district courtrooms unannounced. Yet the idea that Chief Justice Roberts was just a few floors away stirred a sense of possibility. If the corruption were become glaring enough, maybe, just maybe, a higher power would intervene. When the hearing reconvened, tension thicker than any I'd felt before weighed upon the room. Langston, tapping a pen against his bench, seemed impatient. Holloway offered me a patronizing smile as I tried to outline the significance of the financial statements. Each page, I argued, bore the same pattern of questionable funds funneling to Lancaster Real Estate to shell companies that local citizens claimed pointed back to certain influential members of the bench. The immediate reaction was hawkish. Holloway's face darkened and Langston barked, "Ms. Maya Caldwell, we are not here to entertain unsubstantiated gossip. Unless you have concrete exhibits showing a direct link, I'm not inclined to continue down this line of questioning." My mind raced. In the gallery, a few reporters typed frenetically, capturing every word. They had sensed the tension from the start, but now it was crackling like exposed wire. I pressed forward, brandishing a cluster of documents. "Your Honor, if you examine these transactions, you'll see that Lancaster Real Estate's holdings correspond to decisions rendered by this very court. It's not gossip. It's a pattern." Holloway scowled. "That's enough." He looked about to strike my evidence from the record when, suddenly, the massive wooden doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open. Heads turned. Gasps spread through the room. There, standing in the threshold, was Chief Justice John Roberts. His presence was unmistakable. A composed figure wearing a dark suit, his expression measured yet quietly intense. Behind him, a small cluster of aides hovered in cautious silence. The entire courtroom froze as though gripped by an invisible force. Langston momentarily forgot to conceal his shock. Holloway's complexion paled, and the defense counsel scrambled to appear politely curious rather than alarmed. Roberts walked in calmly, scanning the courtroom as if appraising its atmosphere. Then he dipped his head courteously. "I apologize for the interruption," he said. "May I observe for a moment? Judges don't typically say no when the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court requests to watch proceedings. In fact, they rarely get the chance to say no, because it's virtually unheard of. Uncertainty flickered over Langston's face. He cleared his throat and gestured stiffly. Of course, Chief Justice Roberts, we would be honored. I resisted the urge to let out a shaky breath of relief. Something in me flared with renewed confidence. This was no ordinary day, and perhaps no ordinary hearing. If the Chief Justice witnessed the staggering bias on display, it might just crack the walls that had shielded these corrupt judges for years. Roberts settled in the back row, crossing his legs with quiet composure. Langston tried to resume the hearing with an air of normalcy, but the dynamic had irreversibly shifted. Holloway's usual smirk faltered as he glanced at me, perhaps wondering if I had arranged the chief's sudden appearance. I could almost read their thoughts. Did she orchestrate this? Does she have that kind of pull? Of course I hadn't, but I also didn't plan on squandering the moment. With Roberts watching, I resumed my argument, presenting evidence page by page, matching transactions to instances where Lancaster Real Estate's legal challenges magically disappeared onto Judge Langston's or Holloway's gavel. The defense objected repeatedly, but the weight of the chief's gaze seemed to cool some of the judge's prejudices. They let me speak, even if grudgingly. Midway through my explanation, I saw Langston's jaw clench as though he were wrestling with whether to shut me down. Holloway tapped his pen nervously. Meanwhile, my client, Mrs. Jennings, seemed as stunned as the rest of court. She had no idea who the newcomer was, but she must have sensed the gravity in the air. My voice never wavered. I was fueled by the possibility that real justice might at last be within reach. A hush settled as I introduced an affidavit written by an insider, an accountant who had once managed the finances for Lancaster Real Estate. The affidavit alluded to hush money paid to certain parties with judicial influence. Hence also suggested that one of these parties was a public official who oversaw eviction rulings. The affidavit was redacted somewhat to protect the accountant's identity, but the suggestion was clear. Holloway, face stiff, demanded to see the affidavit. He tried to pick it apart, calling it hearsay, but I reminded him that it was properly notarized and included direct references to bank statements. All we need, I concluded, is for the court to allow us to subpoena those records. If the court resists, it effectively denies the truth a chance to surface. Langston grew silent. Then, with forced casualness, he turned to the defense counsel. Have you any counter-argument about the affidavit, or can you confirm or deny its authenticity? The defense stammered, flipping through their notes. We reject it as incomplete. We believe it is an attempt to smear Lancaster Real Estate with no credible foundation. Roberts, from the back, leaned in, absorbing every word. There was no direct involvement from him. He was only an observer, but he didn't need to intervene for the effect of his presence to loom over proceedings. No one dared to call for an early recess with Roberts in the room. Thus the hearing dragged on longer than anticipated, each side revealing more cards. At one point the defense tried to pivot and question Mrs. Jennings's finances, implying that she was behind on her mortgage and using the courts to stall an inevitable foreclosure. But I countered by showing how her payments had been systematically misapplied. The real estate mogul pulling the strings behind Lancaster twisted the numbers in their favor. When the midday recess finally came, I gathered my documents, heart pounding from the marathon of arguments. Just as I was about to exit, a gentle voice called, "Ms. Caldwell." I turned, startled to see Chief Justice Roberts approaching. A few attorneys lingered, gawking openly at the unprecedented scene. He extended his hand, which I shook respectfully. "I appreciate your advocacy," he said, a small, kind smile on his lips. "Your presentation is thorough. Justice can be arduous work, especially when the obstacles are formidable." My throat felt tight. The world suddenly felt real and surreal all at once. "Thank you for listening, Chief Justice." I managed. "I hope you can glean, the significance of what's happening here." His eyes glinted with an understanding that felt deeper than mere courtesy. "I do," he replied quietly, before bidding me goodbye and heading down the corridor with his aides in tow. I found a quiet hallway bench to sit on, trying to gather my wits. My phone buzzed incessantly with messages from colleagues, friends, and reporters who had gotten wind of the Chief Justice's presence. Everybody wanted to know what it meant. Did it signal a higher level review? Could it mean the Supreme Court was eyeing local corruption cases? The speculation was dizzying. Mrs. Jennings approached me timidly, her eyes glassy with hope and fear. Was that really the Chief Justice of Supreme Court? She asked, as though verifying she hadn't dreamed the entire encounter. I nodded, offering a reassuring pat on her hand. Yes, it was. And he saw what's happening, a small miracle in itself. She exhaled, shoulders shaking. Do you think he'll punish the judges if they're corrupt? Or will they cover it up? I wished I had a definitive answer. Instead, I said something about truth eventually surfacing. In my heart, I wondered if the system was robust enough to prosecute judges at the highest level. Judges like Langston and Holloway had built powerful networks of influence, but if we could shine enough light on their misdeeds, maybe we'd open a path to real justice. Afternoon session resumed under fresh tension. Langston's annoyance at the man in the back row, Chief Justice Roberts, was barely concealed now. In the first moments, Langston glared at me like I was the orchestrator of his public scrutiny. Holloway's mouth was set in a thin line. The defense, emboldened by the intimidation tactics of Lancaster Real Estate, requested that all further references to the alleged hush money be stricken from the record, citing lack of relevance. But my motions pressed for full disclosure. If the question pertains to who benefits from illegal evictions, it's entirely relevant, Your Honor, I stated calmly. I had half expected a swift denial from Langston, but he hesitated, exchanging a look with Holloway. Both men were too smart to show blatant partiality, with Roberts watching. We'll take that under submission, said Langston curtly, setting aside the defense counsel's request for the moment. A dull hush fell, and the hearing inched forward. We covered more territory, from patterns of contradictory rulings to a sudden influx of new property acquisitions by Lancaster. A swirl of evidence coalesced into a single conclusion. Something unprecedented was happening in this courtroom. My best hope was that we were rewriting the normal script, forging a new path where the powerful could be confronted without fear. By day's end, Judges Langston and Holloway recessed the hearing until the following week. Their posture and clipped statements reeked of frustration. I recognized what was happening. They were stalling, hoping that the Chief Justice would leave town, and the spotlight would dim, allowing them to return to their usual manipulations. But the media had latched onto the story, and the presence of Roberts had only heightened public curiosity. Mrs. Jennings and I emerged from the courthouse to find a sea of reporters hungry for quotes. Microphones and cameras crowded us. Ms. Caldwell, can you confirm rumors of corruption? Is it true the Chief Justice supports your case? Do you have evidence that judges are accepting bribes? Keeping my composure, I offered measured responses. We have presented strong evidence of misconduct, and we trust the process to uncover the full truth. We appreciate the Chief Justice's attention, but we can't speculate on his actions. That night, I barely slept. My small apartment felt claustrophobic as I pored over more documents, rechecking every fact. I knew forces were at work, trying to discredit me. Already I received a barrage of messages, some threatening, some insulting, but fear wouldn't stop me. If they wanted to fight for justice, I was all in. Over the next few days, the local circuit court found itself under the national spotlight. Whistleblowers from other cases emerged with quiet confessions about Langston handing down suspiciously lenient sentences for known associates, or Holloway rubber-stamping corporate suits that ended up benefiting old campaign donors. The swirl of allegations grew relentless. I spent hours in phone calls with the legal aid group that had first approached me. They had discovered a small trove of sealed documents in old case files that might bolster our claims. Meanwhile, the rumors circulated that Chief Justice Roberts had extended a stay in D.C., possibly to observe more of the local proceedings. The notion that the highest judicial figure might be tailing a corruption scandal roiled both public opinion and the nerves of powerful insiders. Then came a call that sent my heart pounding. It was an unidentified number, and the voice on the other end was low. Ms. Caldwell, I can confirm that certain properties used by Lancaster Real Estate are owned by a judge's family trust. The man said, muffling the phone, if you dig deeper, you'll see the real name behind the trust is Judge Martin Holloway. Just be careful. They're on to you. Before I could ask any questions, The line went dead. Nerves thrummed as I clutched my phone. If Holloway was directly profiting from the real estate deals that were displacing people like Mrs. Jennings, that was an explosive piece of the puzzle. But in a legal realm, I needed bulletproof evidence. Documents linking Holloway's family trust to Lancaster Real Estate, or testimony from professionals who oversaw those transactions. Rumors alone wouldn't topple a judge. I alerted the civil rights organization's lead counsel. We conferred on how to proceed, quietly brainstorming if we could obtain receipts or trust statements. My contact in the local registered deeds office hinted that certain property records might be sealed, but with the right subpoena, we might crack it open. The next morning I prepared for an evidentiary hearing that Langston had scheduled, though it seemed more like a ploy to entangle me in procedural issues than a genuine pursuit of truth. Right before leaving my apartment, I spotted an unmarked car idling across the street. A chill lanced my spine. In D.C., that could be any kind of law enforcement or private investigator. But I had a strong suspicion it was tied to the men who wanted me silenced, stealing myself. I headed to courthouse anyway, determined not to be intimidated. Inside courtroom 6-8 attention was so heavy it felt like a physical presence. Holloway glowered at me when I arrived, while Langston drummed his fingers in silent impatience. I half expected him to lash out with new sanctions or contempt of court threats to muzzle me. Yet once again the door opened, and in walked Chief Justice Roberts, quietly taking a seat. My heart soared, though I tried to keep my expression neutral. I caught a glimpse of the faces of Langston and Holloway. Waves of shock quickly concealed. Their carefully orchestrated intimidation seemed to falter in Roberts's presence. The proceedings began with the defense nitpicking points in my evidentiary plan. They demanded more specifics about the finances, calling it invasive. Holloway nodded sympathetically at them, but as I rose to speak, summoning all the poise I could, I pointed out that if Lancaster had nothing to hide, oversight existed precisely to prevent conflict of interest. I request full disclosure property ownership records, family trusts, and not just for Lancaster Real Estate, but for parties with vested judicial authority. I stated, meeting Holloway's gaze head-on. A fair system cannot allow any whiff of personal gain from bench. A hush followed, the faint sound of someone typing in the press row. Holloway's lip curled and barely contained fury. Judge Langston cleared his throat. Try and maintain composure. M.S. Caldwell, you are venturing dangerously close to accusing members of this bench of unethical behavior. I will remind you that slanderous allegations have consequences. My heart thudded, but I refused to buckle under the threat. I understand the gravity of my statements, Your Honor, I replied evenly, and I trust the evidence will speak for itself once we secure the records. Across the room, the defense counsel whispered fiercely among themselves, exchanging worried glances. Holloway rubbed his temple with a trembling hand, as if warding off a headache of his own making. Meanwhile, I sensed Roberts's intense gaze, as though he were mentally cataloging every nuance of the exchange. The hearing ended with a hesitant partial grant of my request. Langston declared that a limited subpoena of Lancaster real estate documents could proceed, but with numerous restrictions. It was a half step forward, a small victory overshadowed by potential sabotage behind the scenes. Still, I took it. Each official acknowledgement of the evidence was a crack in their armor. As we adjourned, reporters clamored for positions near the exit. Roberts disappeared quietly, leaving behind an unspoken tension. Would this checkpoint of accountability push Langston and Holloway further into a corner, or provoke them into a more brazen attack? That afternoon, my phone buzzed with a message from a colleague. Check your laptop security. Heard rumors of hacking attempts. My stomach clenched. The deeper I delved into the families of these judges, the more I risked drawing serious retaliation. A part of me worried about doxing or false allegations that might tarnish my reputation, but I reminded myself I was fighting on behalf of ordinary people like Mrs. Jennings who wouldn't have a chance otherwise. Sure enough, by the time I got home, I noticed suspicious pop-ups on my laptop as if someone tried to install remote access software. I spent the next few hours changing passwords, backing up my files offline, and scanning everything with security tools. Another reminder that powerful men don't hesitate to resort to underhanded methods. Late that night, while sorting through new leads, I stumbled on details about an old case from 6 years ago where Holloway had presided over a land development dispute. The official ruling seemed abrupt. No discovery, no depositions, and a millionaire developer won with stunning ease. The developer's name, Lancaster Real Estate's founder, Gregory Lancaster. The same pattern repeated. Holloway awarding a land victory to Lancaster in record time. My pulse quickened with each line I read. Certain I'd found another puzzle piece. The next hearing loomed, and each side prepared for a showdown. There was talk of the subpoena's scope. Would it include family trusts like the rumored Holloway Trust? Would Langston block me from accessing them? I knew they would try. Yet the partial granting of my motion gave me a narrow window to prove wrongdoing. I spent the weekend with a small team, combing public records, cross-referencing addresses, trust names, and shell companies. The process was tedious, but a pattern emerged. Holloway Real Property Trust had acquired a set of commercial lots, flipping them to Lancaster Real Estate at suspiciously inflated prices. Sure enough, 2 months later, Holloway signed rulings favorable to Lancaster in unrelated lawsuits. The timeline was damning. Coming across these matches felt like discovering the final threads of a tapestry that spelled corruption. My hands shook from a mix of triumph and dread. I emailed the compiled data to my close colleagues, ensuring multiple backups. If something happened to me, the truth had to survive. Monday morning arrived. The courthouse buzzed like an electrical hive. Even from the sidewalk, I could sense the uneasy tension. Everyone seemed to anticipate fireworks behind those wooden double doors in Courtroom 6A. Stepping inside Courtroom 6A that morning was like stepping onto a stage under a million watchful eyes. The gallery was packed with reporters, law students, activists, you name it. Word had spread of the allegiances between Lancaster Real Estate and the bench, and that the Chief Justice might appear again. Sure enough, as I took my seat beside Mrs. Jennings, I felt a stir of movement at the back. I glanced over my shoulder to see Roberts quietly entering. This time Langston and Holloway spotted him immediately, exchanging tense looks. They commenced the session by addressing the subpoena. The defense, as predicted, threw everything into questioning the request. Holloway, with barely concealed rage, insisted that no personal or familial trust records can be relevant, but I calmly rose and argued. We have discovered property flips from a trust linked to your honor, sold to Lancaster Real Estate at above market prices, followed by judicial rulings in Lancaster's favor. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Langston barked, "Ms. Caldwell, watch your tone. You're accusing a sitting judge of direct conflict of interest." "Yes," I said, mustering courage, "and I have documentation to prove it." With that, I handed the thick packet to clerk, who, eyes wide, passed it up to the bench. Chief Justice Roberts looked on, expression inscrutable, as Holloway snatched the documents and skimmed them. His face reddened to a near-purple hue. Langston flipped through the pages, eyebrows knitting. The hush was deafening, like the entire room had collectively held its breath. I braced for Holloway or Langston to lash out, and lash out they did. Holloway snorted. "This is an outrageous invasion of my private financial matters. I see no legitimacy in the so-called evidence. Ms. Caldwell, you are undermining the integrity of this court with slander." A swirl of adrenaline hit me, but I kept my voice measured. The law requires recusal when a judge's impartiality is in question. If this trust belongs to you, and if you have profited from deals with Lancaster, you should have recused yourself from any case involving them or their affiliates, and not presided over Mrs. Jennings' eviction dispute. Langston gave Holloway a sideways look, perhaps seeking reassurance. In the back row, a few spectators whispered, while reporters scribbled furiously. Meanwhile, Roberts's gaze flicked to the documents. It was a moment loaded with possibility. Would they shut this down, or would the system prove itself bigger than the corrupted men who thought themselves untouchable? What happened next broke from the realm of normal courtroom drama. Chief Justice Roberts stood, addressing both the bench and the gallery with careful tempered words. "As an observer, I am not here preside," he began, "but it is clear this matter transcends typical preliminary proceedings. The integrity of the judiciary is paramount. If there is evidence of a direct conflict of interest, the correct course of action will be immediate recusal, followed by an independent review. That is, if the evidence stands. The room felt electrified. Langston's eyes darted from Holloway to Roberts, struggling to maintain a veneer of composure. Holloway's arrogance bristled. But there was no graceful way to challenge the highest judicial officer in the country. A muscle twitched in his jaw. Holloway ground out, "Your presence here, Chief Justice, is highly irregular." Roberts offered him a measured nod. "Indeed, so is a suggestion that a presiding judge might be compromised." A wave of murmurs rippled. Meanwhile, my heart thudded in my chest. This was the moment we'd been bracing for. If Holloway or Langston try to brazen their way past this, they will be spitting in the face of the highest court itself. Then again, desperate men sometimes do desperate things. A tense silence followed. Finally, Langston cleared his throat. "In light of these sensational allegations, we will temporarily suspend a hearing to verify the authenticity of these documents. Judge Holloway will, for the time being, step back from this case, pending internal review." He shot Holloway a meaningful glare, as if instructing him to keep his temper in check. Holloway stiffened, fists clenched at his sides. Then, in a forced display of cooperation, he stood, glaring daggers at me. "I will vacate the bench for today," he hissed. "But mark my words, Mrs. Caldwell, your theatrics will not stand once the facts are laid bare." With that, Holloway strode out, his roll billowing behind him like a dark cloud. Everyone in the gallery seemed to exhale collectively, a swirl of shock and curiosity swirling in the room. Roberts cast a final glance, leaving with his aides in a more measured, dignified manner. Mrs. Jennings gripped my hand so tightly I thought my fingers might go numb. Tears glistened in her eyes. "Did that really just happen?" she whispered. "A Supreme Court justice basically calling him out in open court." I nodded slowly, letting the magnitude settle over me. "Yes," I replied. "Our battle's not done, but a wall just cracked." With Holloway suddenly recused and presumably under investigation, my next challenge was handling Langston, who remained on the panel. Though one layer of corruption had been peeled back, I suspected Langston had his own skeletons. Evidence we gathered was less direct about his involvement, but enough whisperings indicated a silent partnership with Lancaster. Did he think sacrificing Holloway would shield him from scrutiny? Back at my apartment, I received an urgent message from the same unknown source. "Langston is moving assets. Offshore. Check the Caymans. He's trying to cover his tracks." My pulse hammered. If we could trace him funneling bribe money or real estate profits into offshore accounts, we'd have a double hit. Lancaster's lawyers would scramble to distance themselves from the meltdown, and the entire case might crumble in front of a new unbiased judge. Yet proving offshore dealings required tight cooperation with financial institutions and, ideally, a law enforcement or federal subpoena. That was definitely beyond the scope of a local civil hearing, unless the scandal grew big enough to attract federal attention. I realized we might already be there. Holloway's recusal, the presence of Chief Justice Roberts, the intense media coverage, all were signs that higher authorities had their eyes on this fiasco. A swirl of days followed, each bringing new seismic shifts. Holloway's abrupt removal triggered an internal disciplinary probe by the Judicial Council. Rumors flew that he might resign quietly to avoid a messy impeachment. Meanwhile, Langston tried to distance himself publicly, calling Holloway's alleged impropriety deeply troubling. But behind closed doors I doubted he'd change his ways. I continued to represent Mrs. Jennings, meeting with Lancaster's counsel before a newly appointed judge who seemed neutral so far. That hearing felt like breathing fresh air after being suffocated in 6A. At last the central, Mrs. Jennings' eviction, was considered on factual merits, not payoffs or behind-the-scenes deals. Even the local press, such as the Washington Post, wrote about how a small landlord-tenant case sparked an entire judicial reckoning. Then, as if orchestrated by fate, the FBI stepped in. Agents visited me, politely requesting the records and evidence I had accumulated against Holloway and potentially Langston. They explained they were opening an investigation into public corruption at the judicial level. The lead agent, a steely-eyed woman, commended my courage. "We rarely see such direct exposure from within a court proceeding," she noted. "I gave them everything, bank statements, property records, trust documents. This was bigger than me alone now, and I welcomed the reinforcements. Yet victory felt bittersweet. Each day brought more stories of innocent plaintiffs and defendants railroaded by Holloway and Langston's manipulations, families losing homes, small businesses destroyed, battered women denied fair hearings. The heartbreak was immense. I found a grim sense of purpose fueling me, determined not to let justice falter. Meanwhile, the FBI's probe quietly advanced. Agents asked me to keep details confidential, though rumors inevitably leaked. I braced for retaliation. Late one evening, a brick was thrown through my apartment window, shattering glass and leaving me trembling. The next morning, I discovered a spray-painted warning on my car. "Back off, traitor." Fear coiled in my chest. I was naive. Exposing corruption layered with money and power can provoke desperate violent acts. However, the tide of public sentiment had turned. Neighborhood watch groups, church ministries, and advocacy organizations rallied around me and my client. They recognized that if judges were in bed with wealthy developers, no ordinary citizen was safe from predatory land grabs or rigged verdicts. Ruth Simmons, a local community leader, told me, "This is bigger than your case. You're standing for all of us." The weight of that responsibility pressed heavy on my soul, but also kept me from succumbing to intimidation. Despite the threats and harassment, a bright moment came when a new judge overseeing Mrs. Jennings' eviction suit ruled that Lancaster Real Estate's claims lacked proper documentation, immediately halting the eviction process. Mrs. Jennings cried tears of joy, though the final resolution would wait until the broader investigations concluded. Still, that initial ruling complied with real evidence rather than hush money, an affirmation that justice could still prevail when decoupled from corruption. Langston, meanwhile, stayed on the bench for other cases, at least until the Judicial Council completed their deep dive. He appeared more cautious, rarely showing the arrogance that once colored his every action. Some attorneys gossiped that Langston was trying to salvage his career, while letting Holloway bear the full brunt of the scandal. I suspected he was scrambling to hide his own dirty deals, or praying that the FBI wouldn't unearth them, but the FBI was thorough. Through legal channels, they began tracing large sums from Lancaster's corporate accounts to a shell corporation. The name of the shell, HQ Offshore, ironically echoing Langston's initials. Day by day, puzzle pieces fell into place. My phone buzzed with cryptic updates. "We're getting close," the lead agent texted. My heart soared. One crisp morning, a wave of commotion erupted in the courthouse halls. Word spread in hushed urgency. Holloway had been arrested. He apparently tried to flee the area, heading for a private airstrip before the FBI apprehended him under probable cause related to wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit bribery. Reporters nearly trampled each other to get the scoop. I was in the lobby when the news broke. Journalists rushing me for a statement. Maya called, "Well, you exposed these deals. Did you know Holloway would run?" they asked. I carefully responded that I only pursued the truth and wasn't privy to his personal decisions. Deep inside, I felt relief that the man who fed me now faced accountability. But I also braced because this put Langston in an even tighter spot. Sure enough, the next day, the Judicial Council announced a formal censure hearing for Langston. They found enough preliminary evidence of his involvement with Lancaster Real Estate to question his fitness for the bench. Immediately, social media lit up with speculation. Would he resign or fight the allegations? As these developments unfolded, there was a sense that we stood on a precipice of historic proportions, a potential toppling of corrupt pillars at the heart of the judiciary. The hearing for Langston's censure was scheduled in the same imposing courthouse that had witnessed the meltdown of Holloway's credibility. Langston, stoic and pale, took a seat at a smaller table than the one he usually commanded from the bench. Across from him sat members of the Judicial Council, senior judges, lawyers, and legal scholars, all tasked with evaluating the evidence I attended as a witness, my stomach swirling with nerves. It was surreal to see the man who once sneered from a position of near absolute authority reduced to a defendant's posture. Cameras were barred from inside, but the hallway outside teemed with media. One by one, the council members questioned Langston about his association with Lancaster Real Estate, the spike in his offshore assets, and email threads that indicated backroom deals. His defense lawyers tried to spin the narrative as coincidental or circumstantial, but the FBI's forensic evidence was compelling. They had unearthed direct bank transfers linking Lancaster's shell companies to Langston's personal accounts in the Caymans. Langston glared at me when I testified, but I remained calm, recounting how he'd systematically denied my motions, furthering Lancaster's advantage. The counsel took note of every detail. In a corner of the room, Chief Justice Roberts observed quietly, arms folded. After days of testimony, cross-examination, and legal maneuvering, the Judicial Council reached a decision. They determined that there was substantial evidence of misconduct and recommended Langston's removal from the bench. Furthermore, they referred the matter to federal prosecutors for potential criminal charges. A quiet gasp rippled to the hearing room as the counsel read their findings. Langston's face hardened with shock and bitterness. Moments after the decision was announced, Langston stood, scowling at me. "This whole fiasco, do you think you've won? Do you think toppling me will fix everything?" I felt a pang of empathy, quickly replaced by resolve. "I think restoring faith in justice matters more than one man's career." I responded evenly. There was no dramatic meltdown, no flurry of handcuffs in that instant. He would face due process, the same as Holloway, but the writing on the wall spelled out the end of his tyranny on the bench. For the first time since my journey began, I felt a tangible sense of relief. We'd done it. We had exposed both judges. The tide had fully turned. Outside, the press clamored. Mrs. Jennings rushed toward me, tears of gratitude shining in her eyes. "We did it," she breathed, hugging me tightly. In the aftermath, Lancaster Real Estate's empire faced a torrent of civil suits. Their top executives distanced themselves from Gregory Lancaster, who was rumored to be under grand jury investigation. Meanwhile, Holloway and Langston became subjects of national news. The entire scandal ignited a broader conversation about judicial ethics and how easily power can be corrupted. Chief Justice Roberts concluded his business in D.C., but left a significant memo behind in the judicial newsletters, emphasizing the need for heightened oversight and transparency at all levels of the bench. His subtle, understated intervention had sparked a wave of reforms. The local courts initiated new checks for financial disclosures, and a few states even proposed similar measures for their own judges. As for me, I found myself immersed in a swirl of interviews recognized by nonprofits fighting for court reforms. But I declined most offers for TV appearances and turned down the idea of running for office. My passion remained the practice of law, helping everyday citizens navigate a system that, while flawed, could still dispense justice if we fought hard enough. In quiet moments, I remember that initial terrified feeling of stepping into courtroom 6A. The fear was real, but courage had outweighed it, and the results were so much bigger than just one eviction case. As a legal storm settled, I visited Mrs. Jennings in her newly renovated home, a modest, cozy place she'd nurtured for decades. We sat in her kitchen, sipping sweet tea as the evening sun cast golden rays across her dining table. "Maya, words can't express how grateful I am," she said softly, "because you stood up to those judges. I have my home, and so many others have a fighting chance." I gave her hand a gentle squeeze. "You gave me a fighting reason," I replied. "This was never just about a property line. It was about a principle." She nodded teary-eyed. A sense of warmth blossomed in my chest. Even though the nights of personal danger, hacking attempts and intimidation had left scars on my psyche, moments like this reaffirmed that progress is possible. Before I left, she mentioned that neighbors were raising funds for a local legal clinic, naming it after her late husband, who'd been a community advocate. She asked if I would help volunteer. Without hesitation, I said yes. The seeds of change that we planted in that courtroom could grow broader, reaching more people who felt powerless before an unjust system. Life moved on in unexpected yet fulfilling ways. My name became entwined with the words judicial accountability, and I found myself called upon to speak at universities and bar association conferences. At times I felt like an imposter, just a young attorney who barely escaped a nightmare unscathed. But the recurring question from audiences was simple. How do you keep going when the judges were so powerful? My answer always circled back to the same principle. We are the guardians of our own democracy. If we don't hold power accountable, No one else will. Meanwhile, Holloway's trial began, overshadowed by sensational headlines about offshore accounts and lavish kickbacks. Langston's lawyers tried legal maneuvers to claim ignorance, but the evidence was overwhelming. The final convictions were not a matter of if, but when, and though corruption is never truly eradicated, these convictions would send a potent message to all who considered abusing the gavel for personal gain. In a gracious gesture, Chief Justice Roberts sent me a shorthand written note. Thank you for reminding us that vigilance matters at every level. Whitmore. I framed it in my office, a silent testament to the extraordinary journey we'd been through. One evening, I strolled around the Columbia Heights neighborhood after finishing a pro bono consultation. My mind was flooded with reflections of the entire saga. Stepping into that courthouse, the faint mocking from Holloway, the nerve-wracking confrontation, and the hush that enveloped the court when the Chief Justice walked in. I wonder if I'd ever experience anything so dramatic again in my career. Passing by a Viber mural that read Justice of People, I stopped to watch street dancers move to pulsating music. Their raw energy spoke to me of resilience, freedom, and a pursuit of unfiltered expression. It reminded me that, at its core, justice is about people. People who love, dream, dance, and live. People whose lives could be shattered by a corrupt system or protected by a fair one. My phone pinged, a text from Mrs. Jennings, simply reading, "Thank you for being you." I smiled at the screen, realizing that my life had forever changed. I was no longer the nervous attorney overshadowed by two omnipotent judges. I was Maya Caldwell, the woman who took on the bench and refused to be silenced. The echoes of that transformation felt profound. In the weeks that followed, the final verdict arrived. Holloway and Langston faced separate criminal proceedings. Both were convicted of financial crimes relating to bribery, fraud, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. The sensational details, a secret ledger, coded messages, lavish gifts, emerged in public trial transcripts. Tabloids ran lurid headlines, while serious newspapers dissected the systematic betrayal of the judiciary. Ultimately, both men were sentenced to prison terms, stripped of their robes, their reputations in tatters. During sentencing, Holloway wore a grim face, no longer able to threaten me with retaliation. Langston tried to maintain a veneer of dignity, claiming he'd been coerced by Lancaster's influence. The judge delivering their punishment left no doubt. This court must uphold the principle that no one, not even those who wield the gavel, is above the law. A ripple of applause broke out among onlookers. In that moment, I thought of the hard karma that had boomeranged. These judges who once sneered at me and countless others found themselves at the mercy of a fairer system. Irony of the highest order. They discovered the law is not a tool for the powerful to manipulate, but a safeguard meant for all. Even a young attorney named Maya Caldwell. Standing on the loamy steps of the grand courthouse one last time, I inhaled the crisp air, letting the memories wash through me. I recalled the initial swirl of fear, the condescending smirks of the corrupt judges, an electrifying moment when Chief Justice Henry Whitmore entered, shifting the entire atmosphere. I remembered the hush in the gallery, the thunder of my own heartbeat, and the culmination of events that led to two arrogant men finally facing the consequences of their actions. My reflection, this case underscored that the integrity of our legal system hinges on the willingness of people, lawyers, citizens, even Supreme Court justices, to challenge abuses of power. When we question corruption and speak the truth, we send ripples through institutions often deemed untouchable. Yes, it can be perilous. Retaliation is real. But if we yield to fear, then the unscrupulous will continue their reign unchecked. So I invite you to reflect on your own experiences. Have you ever encountered a situation where authority was misused or integrity was undermined? How did you respond or wish you could have responded? Share your thoughts, your stories, your voice. Because at the crossroads of silence and speaking, share your thoughts, your stories, your voice. Because at the crossroads of silence and speaking out, real change takes shape, and in that choice lies our collective hope for a system